Very much, Lord Allardyce, for a very kind introduction. Let me just try to share my screen. Okay, you can see that?
Yep.
Okay, right, thanks very much. So thanks everyone for your presence today. As Lord Allardyce mentioned, I would like to share in the time available my personal views on this particular topic of white supremacism and its implications. I'd like to also provide a perspective from Southeast Asia, one perspective from Southeast Asia, right? So what I would like to do today is to survey the complex, evolving ideological aspects of the white supremacist threat with a particular focus on the Great Replacement theme. I would like to compare and contrast white supremacist extremism with Islamist extremism, which is, of course, very much of great interest to us in Southeast Asia. And finally, I'd like to provide some thoughts from a Southeast Asian perspective on the implications of white supremacist extremism. So, white supremacist extremism, quite a number of analysts, scholars have been talking about it in recent times. It's a very broad movement, as we know, encompassing extremist elements of white nationalism, neo-Nazism, in the past, Christian Reconstructionism. In the 1990s, we had a Christian identity. More recently, identitarianism, which is a more of a European phenomenon. And other emerging strains, in particular, if you look at the news headlines, especially in the US, if I come across this particular network, the Boogaloo Boys, right, which is a decentralized nationwide network of essentially gun rights advocates that essentially are trying to overthrow the US government. They hate the police, law enforcement. More idiosyncratically, there is this fringe conspiracy movement, QAnon, that promotes the idea that certain well-connected American and other political economic elites, they mentioned Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, George Soros, are all part of a deep state that also incidentally operates a global child sex trafficking ring. It's quite incredible, but that seems to have some traction. And a very unusual trend as well that has emerged is this trend called incels, or involuntary celibates. And this refers to primarily white males who blame their inability to form romantic sexual relationships on the indifference of attractive women and sometimes attractive men. A particular variant of this trend targets interracial relationships, particularly between Black men and white women. So this ties into the overall, white supremacist ideas, right? But these are trends and ideas that sort of float in or float around online. But one particular trend or strain of white supremacist extremism is particularly significant to us in Southeast Asia. And this would be what some have called the Great Replacement or white genocide strain, right? So a major theme within the evolving white supremacist extremist milieu is this idea of Judeo-Christian European nations under threat by non-white immigration, especially Muslims, not only Muslims, but Asians, Hispanics, Jews. In fact, the Christchurch terrorist, Brenton Tarrant, the Australian militant who targeted the two Christchurch mosques last year in New Zealand, he talked about white genocide. So there is this idea about this, the white race being taken over or going to eventually replaced by non-whites. And there are movements, there are groups that have emerged to sort of like take this idea forward through force. Like, so you have, both Breivik, Anders Breivik, the Norwegian militant who carried out the Oslo attacks in 2011, as well as Tarrant, right, on the right, bottom right, who was influenced by Breivik. Both of them reference this so-called Reborn Knights Templar, which was, of course, a 12th century Christian force that fought against Muslim troops in the Crusades. But apart from this Reborn Knights Templar, which you don't hear much about, there have been other networks in Europe. We've heard about the Azov Battalion in the Ukraine, and other affiliates. For example, in the US, you hear about the base, the Atom Weapon Division, and these groups are beginning to network on a transnational basis. And ultimately, they see themselves as defending the white populations around the world, the global white community, if you like, against, in some iterations, a global Muslim invasion, right? And they're very much empowered through social media in a form of leaderless resistance strategy with many decentralized cells globally. Breivik, in fact, talked about this leaderless resistance strategy, and much of the white supremacist material can be found on some of these social media platforms like Reddit, particularly 4chan, 8chan, which was rebranded to 8kun, and there are others. Who are the targets, right? So in this particular scheme, white Western political elites who promote multiculturalism are said to be guilty of aiding and abetting white genocide precisely because of their adoption of multiculturalism. So they are soft on foreigners, right? So that was Breivik's target, right? For others like Tarrant, it is the non-white invaders themselves who are overwhelming white populations and the social systems worldwide to their relatively greater fertility rates. So the non-whites reproduce faster than the whites, and therefore ultimately they're going to get, the white populations are going to get replaced, right? There's also this very strong sense of an eye for an eye retaliatory principle. I mean, in Tarrant's manifesto, for example, he actually laid it out, right? Why he wanted to take action against Muslims in this particular case in New Zealand, because he had a very idiosyncratic approach. But one reason was he said that he wanted to take revenge for hundreds of thousands of deaths caused by foreign invaders throughout European history. He also wanted to avenge thousands of European lives lost to terror attacks. This is more recent, referring to ISIS and Al-Qaeda, right? And ultimately, he seemed to be very taken with the death of a young girl, a Swedish girl, in Stockholm in April 2017. He actually mentioned her. This was a Stockholm car ramming attack by an ISIS individual. So what was the key motivation for the white supremacist extremists? It is to defend the European in-group, or some would call it a Group 10, the European Group 10, if you like, right? So Tarrant himself in his manifesto talked about the crisis of mass immigration. It's an assault on the European people that, if nothing is done, ultimately will result in the complete racial and cultural replacement of the European people. So in terms of the European in-group, and this is from his manifesto, just to give you an idea, Australia, he considers Australians as part of Europe, right? So the origin, as he put it, the origins of my language is European, my culture is European, my beliefs are European. So his identity, although he's Australian, he sees himself as European. So what is to be done? Essentially, Tarrant says that we have to crush immigration, deport those invaders already living in our soil. And who are the invaders? Non-whites, right? It can be African, Indian, Turkish, Semitic. But he targets Muslims because in his view, Muslims have high fertility rates, right? So he has a very detailed explanation as to why targeting Muslims is very important, because they're one of the strongest groups, high fertility, and apparently, in his view, they have a strong in-group bias and they have a strong will to conquer. And why violence? He's very direct, right? He says there's a need to greatly reduce immigration rates by intimidating the non-whites, to agitate the political. He wants to spark overreaction on the part of his political enemies, and to create a conflict, a racial conflict, right? to further divide the European people and invaders. So it talks about direct action. In fact, this is very interesting, this whole direct action idea, because some of the US groups like the base atom weapon division, they also talk about this philosophy of accelerationism, where you don't wait for things to happen. You incite a conflict directly and spark a conflict, and you make things happen, right? And ultimately, there's a desire to take direct action to destabilize society, spark a racial war, and usher in, a war for establishing a white ethno state. And he has even given, this is from Tarrant's manifesto, he says there's no problem attacking civilians, right? Because, the civilian, the unarmed invader is, in fact, to him, far more dangerous, and then the armed invader. You can fight the armed invader, but, the unarmed invader, the unarmed invader is a tricky entity to deal with, because they are not attacking you, so how can we attack them? But his point is, there would be wrong thinking, because the unarmed invader is just as dangerous as the armed invader, because the unarmed invader insidiously is able to subvert and destroy the nation from within, right? So this is something which is considered very dangerous thinking. And Tarrant actually did try to, in his own idiosyncratic way, try to come up with why all this action, direct action, is needed, because ultimately, in his view, there is a need to create a white ethno state. Europe can only be Europe. There shouldn't be any mixing, right? There shouldn't be any mixing. There is no such thing. Immigration shouldn't be allowed, because if we are open immigration, there will be no more Europeans, because Europe's value lies only in European people, right? And apart from political goals, what is interesting about his manifesto even talks about spiritual goals, in a sense that, we have to be more than ourselves. Strong men do not get ethnically replaced. Strong men do not allow their culture to degrade. Strong men do not allow their people to die. Weak men have created a situation, and strong men need to fix it. And his call is embrace infamy. The enemies of your people will beset you on all sides. Otherwise, the media may paint you as villains. The state will call you traitors, right? But basically, he's saying it doesn't matter. Just do what you have to do. You will be infamous until victory is achieved. Take it with a smile, right? And so it's very interesting when you compare what this strain of white supremacists who are talking about cultural or white genocide, when you compare them with the old jihadist mantra, we love death more than you love life. It's almost like a kind of mirror image, right? It's kind of like an ideological mirror image, because if you look at the Islamic side of the fence, whether you call it Salafi jihadism or other isms, right? Just like the white supremacists, the Islamists also say, the Islamist extremists also say that there is a cosmic war for survival going on between the Jewish Crusader axis and the global Islamic community. And just like groups like the Azov Battalion in the Ukraine, or the Atom Weapon Division and others, there's Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and their affiliated networks are defending the global Islamic community, right, against the Jewish Crusader axis, which I guess in this particular case could be the Western world, which is encroaching upon Islam, the world of Islam. And similar to the white supremacists, these guys, the Islamists, Islamist extremists, are also social media empowered through Facebook, Telegram, WhatsApp. Where Telegram is used in Southeast Asia, a lot, WhatsApp as well. And the same way that the likes of Tarrant justifies attacks on civilians, right? The Islamist extremists also justify attacks on civilians, but for a different reason. Ultimately, to the Islamist extremists, there is no such thing as an innocent civilian, because the taxes of the civilians, Western civilians and allied civilians, their taxes and political support for their governments enable the governments to carry out oppression of Muslim populations around the world. So civilians can be targeted. And just like the white supremacists, the Islamists also believe in the concept of an eye for an eye, or for reciprocity, right? Retaliation. You kill our civilians, we will kill your civilians as well. But in terms of comparing the threats, right? In terms of what it's like, I mean, the Sufan Center has done a study, and they've basically identified that, between 2001 and 2016, 73% of deadly violent extremist incidents were done by the white supremacists, with Islamists being responsible for only 23%. The Institute for Economics and Peace study last year identified Western Europe, North America, Australia, New Zealand, taken as a whole, white supremacist attacks made up 17.2% of all terrorist incidents, compared to only 6.8% by the Islamist extremists. And Europol, 2 years ago, mentioned that between 1970 and 2018 in the West, there were 26 Islamist attacks, killing at least 10 people, as opposed to 11 white supremacist attacks. So in other words, right, while white supremacist attacks in the West may be becoming more frequent, thus far, they are not as deadly as the Islamist terror attacks, because the average Islamist terror attack since 1970 has been more deadly, more lethal compared to the white supremacist attacks. So the white supremacist attacks are getting more frequent, but thus far, they are less lethal on balance, on average, than the Islamist attacks. Although I note that recently, this year, the Department of Homeland Security in the US considers the white supremacist threat as the most significant threat, right? And how is this threat generally manifested nowadays? I believe the lone wolf threat is very significant. I mean, this lone wolf threat can be manifested by both sides, both the Islamists and the white supremacists. I mean, there's a well-known Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula English language magazine called Inspire. Several years ago, they came out with an English language article called How to Make a Bomb in the Kitchen of Your Mom. That was even actually translated into Bahasa in Southeast Asia, Bahasa Indonesia in Southeast Asia. The lone wolf phenomenon has come to Southeast Asia as well. I mean, there are two trajectories. A lone wolf, perhaps downstream, if it's a radicalized scientist or a cyber warrior, I mean, the lone wolf type of attack could be more high tech, but by and large nowadays, at this present time, it's more what the Sufan group calls the weaponization of everyday life, right? Which I think is a very nice phrase, the weaponization of everyday life, where essentially everyday weapons like cars and knives are used, right? So you see, you can see this this slide, right? I mean, a top right-hand corner, you see a truck attack, and this was Islamist truck attack. I believe that was Germany, right? Below that gentleman, this was in Tunisia. He killed. This was Islamist extremists, ISIS, Islamist extremists. He killed British tourists. Michael Adibalajo, the Sun headline, he killed the British soldier Lee Rigby in broad daylight, May 2013, and this was a lone wolf attack. And by the way, you can see the ideology right there, the ideological narrative right there on the Sun headline. On the bottom left-hand corner, these were the Boston Marathon bombers who built a pressure cooker bomb. They built a pressure cooker bomb by learning the methodology online, and I believe they referred to that article in Inspire magazine, How to Make a Bomb in the Kitchen of Your Mom. If I'm not mistaken, I believe that's what they did. So they learned it online. And what is significant is Brenton Tarrant, right, bottom right-hand corner. I mean, in his manifesto, he also talked about using trucks in ramming attacks, just like ISIS. So there is this suggestion that they are both sides are learning from one another. And how they learn from one another is truly the impact of social media. Globally, Islamists and white supremacist extremism, they fuel each other through reciprocal radicalization into terrorist actions. And in fact, this is why I fully agreed with the New Zealand Prime Minister Ardern when she called in May last year, together with the French president, for the Christchurch call, where the call was for governments and tech firms to eliminate extremist content online. I think it's very important because Tarrant, as we know, he live streamed the New Zealand mosque attack, and this, in fact, the concern was the danger of fueling possible copycat attacks on the white supremacist extremist side, or retaliatory attacks on the Islamist extremist side for what had happened to the Christchurch mosque. So, in fact, we have had real-world evidence of this happening because on 27 April last year, just a couple of months after the Christchurch attack, this gentleman, John Ernest, he killed a lady in a synagogue. He was, by his own admission, he was inspired by the Christchurch mosque shootings and another synagogue shooting in the US a year earlier. I mean, he attended church, right? And so this shows you once again that all faiths can have extremist trends, right? John Ernest admitted to an arson attack on a mosque the previous month. So that guy was inspired by Tarrant, but this guy was, he wanted to avenge the action of Tarrant, and he wanted to bomb a white extremist rally. And by the way, I think he was also trying to make a pressure cooker bomb by looking at the picture, right? So he was thwarted by the FBI. So on the one hand, you had John Ernest, who was inspired by Tarrant to carry out attacks. On the other hand, you had this guy, Mark Stephen Domingo, who wanted to take revenge for the Christchurch attack. So you see both trends. That's why social media is very important. Now I'm coming to the end, but I believe that we should also have a brief note about the twofold impact of COVID-19. I don't think COVID-19 has had a transformational impact because many analysts are talking about that. For example, if you look at Southeast Asia, and I would say they say more broadly, on the one hand, there's an operational impact because security forces have been forced to devote more resources to the COVID-19 situation, and this has created more operational space for the Abu Sayyaf groups, for example, in the Philippines to operate. The same for the white supremacists. They have called on infected followers in the West to deliberately spread COVID-19 to law enforcement and minority communities. And according to the Site Intelligence Group, they go much further than the Islamist extremists in talking about deliberate infection of law enforcement and minority communities. But also ideologically, if you look at Islamists in Southeast Asia, there's this terror network in Indonesia, Jamal Ansarul Daulah. They claim that COVID-19 is God's sign, that eventually the Islamists will win, right? And as far as the white supremacist extremist groups like Atom Weapon Division and the Base are concerned, as I mentioned, they are using COVID-19 as an attempt to push through their operational philosophy of accelerationism. So ultimately, COVID-19 has been exploited by both sides for their own purposes. So now, what does this mean for Southeast Asia? I think there are three implications. I will go through each of these in turn. I think from the Southeast Asian perspective, there is interest in white supremacist, the white supremacist threat, but it's not so direct. But there's increasing understanding that, many Southeast Asians work overseas. They live and work and study overseas, and, that's where they could be targeted. And in fact, an example in the UK itself, The Guardian just recently talked about how a British civil rights group, End the Virus Racism, mentioned that the National Police Chiefs Council were worried about how the UK's far right was using COVID-19 as a reason to attack East and Southeast Asians. So there is this growing concern within Southeast Asia on what's going to, the threat to the nationals working in the West. But beyond that, right, there's also what I would call the contagion effect of white supremacism, because white supremacism is a kind of far right extremism, right? So, and it's very interesting that Anders Breivik, in his own manifesto in 2011, he actually called for cooperation between the Hindu extremists and the white supremacist extremists to share notes on how they can fight off the Muslims, right? Because according to Breivik, the Muslims were a threat to both Europe and Hindu India. And you know, in Mongolia, there's a very interesting neo-Nazi group, the Sagan caste, that actually admire Hitler, and they target Chinese encroachment in the country, and they go after interracial couples, Mongolian Chinese couples. And let's not forget, presented on this last year, Buddhist extremism in Myanmar. There are groups, networks like Mahabata and Sri Lanka, BBS. They are motivated, of course, not by white nationalism, but a Buddhist nationalist extremist concerns of cultural genocide, and again by supposedly rapacious Muslim minority communities. So, you know, I mean, if if there is been some attempt to establish links between the white supremacists and the Hindu extremists, one wonders whether or not there will be a similar phenomenon observed between the white supremacists and the Buddhist extremists. So ultimately, the contagion effect, right, of white supremacist extremism inspiring other kinds of far-right identity extremism should be watched closely. And this is important. I mean, to just cite a couple of very interesting books and coming to the end, Amy Chua, in a book, Political Tribes, a couple of years ago, she said something very interesting. She was saying that, you know, there is a need, right, to strengthen social cohesion in multicultural societies like the US. She was talking about the US, but I think it's also relevant to Southeast Asia. For example, in the US, Amy Chua was saying that, you know, there is an American super group, right, which is overarching, right? And rather than more parochial identities related to whiteness or Anglo-Protestant culture or European Christianity, you know, this shouldn't be more important than, you know, an overarching American super group identity. And this is, I believe, from Francis Fukuyama, in his book Identity. He was saying that Americans shouldn't go backward into an ethnic or religious understanding of identity, and that the US, as well as other culturally diverse democracies that want to survive, should actually see themselves as a creedal nation. And this I thought was interesting. A creedal nation is one whose ideological foundations are not dependent on any particular race, ethnicity, or religion, but rather, as in the US, on common political principles of constitutionalism, the rule of law, democracy, equal rights, right? And, you know, interestingly, if you look at, say, Singapore, right? Singapore also has a creed, multiracialism, meritocracy, secularism. And this is something which all Singaporeans are drilled in from the time they're young, right? And there's always been a very conscious attempt to protect the Singaporean identity against any narrow identity. For example, nobody says Singapore is a Chinese country, although the Chinese are the ethnic Chinese are the most dominant group in terms of numbers in Singapore, right? And in fact, this is very much in Singapore's cultural DNA. I mean, our founding Prime Minister, the late Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, when Singapore left Malaysia in 1965, he very memorably declared, you know, that Singapore is not a Malay nation, not a Chinese nation, not an Indian nation. Everyone will have a place in Singapore. So there's no ethnic supremacism in Singapore. It is against the Singaporean DNA. And there's no religious supremacism allowed in Singapore either. As a former Deputy Prime Minister Wong Kan Seng put it several years ago, we are not a Christian Singapore or Muslim Singapore, Buddhist or Hindu Singapore. We are secular Singapore in which everybody will have a place in the sun, so to speak. So these are three broad implications I have identified which relate to the current trend of white supremacist extremism, and happy to hear your comments. Thanks very much. That's it. Thanks very much.